My friends, there are moments when the night splits open and history does not whisper, it roars. One strike, two explosions, 3 lives lost before dawn. 4,000 miles away, a superpower pressed its will upon a small nation. But in Burkina Faso, that shock did not breed silence. It birthed a fire. 6 steps. First, the sudden blow. Second, the blood of soldiers and of a villager on sacred soil. Third, the rising of a people in their tens of thousands, banners high, drums beating. Fourth, the world's gaze turning toward West Africa once again. Fifth, the old chains rattling as if to remind us of colonial ghosts. And sixth, the great question, the only one that matters, who will write Africa's story? Shall it be penned in foreign capitals or spoken by the children of the soil? Tonight we gather not for rumor, not for outrage without substance. We gather to ask whether this is the dawn of the awakening our ancestors prayed for. Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. The dawn broke harsh over the Sahel. At precisely 5:42 in the morning, a sound like thunder rolled across the Yatena province of northern Burkina Faso. But this was no storm. It was steel. 2 precision-guided missiles released from the belly of an American aircraft streaked across the sky and struck a rural outpost. When the dust settled, 3 lay dead. 2 soldiers guarding the outpost and a villager who had risen before daybreak. 7 others were wounded, their bodies carried through shattered walls and burning debris. The communications tower that linked security posts across the region was nothing but twisted metal. Officials in Ouagadougou later confirmed what many had feared. The strike had not come from Burkinab soil, nor with Burkinab consent. It originated from a United States Africa command base in Niger, some 380 miles away. No warning, no coordination, no sovereignty respected. That morning, the young president, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, stood before the nation. Dressed in camouflage, eyes dark with resolve, he declared, "This strike was not merely against our land. It was against our right to exist as a free and independent people." Within hours, the entire military, 12,000 active troops, was placed on high alert. Border patrols at Mali and Niger were reinforced with an extra 1,200 soldiers. At strategic sites, the Ouagadougou Air Base, the Koudougou Garrison, readiness rose to DEFCON 2. Yet this was not only a soldier's answer. By nightfall, tens of thousands of citizens poured into Revolution Square. 35,000 voices, banners of red, green and gold waving against the dusk. Drums pounded. Songs of defiance shook the air. "Our land, our right, our future," they cried, a chant that spread within hours across West African social media. From Dakar to Nairobi, the phrase was repeated, reposted, and resung, the voice of a continent stirring. For decades, Africa had been told to accept such violations as the price of partnership. But here, in the heart of Burkina Faso, something shifted. The people did not bow their heads. They lifted them. And so the fire began to burn, lit not only by anger, but by a truth deeper than fear, that Africa's destiny would no longer be dictated by foreign jets in foreign skies. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say Amen in the comments below. The shock of that morning strike did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. It rolled outward, like ripples upon the lake, growing wider, louder, stronger with each passing hour. Within just 18 hours, an extraordinary session of the African Union was convened in Addis Ababa, one of the fastest gatherings in AU history. 42 foreign ministers, connected by secure video lines, answered a single call. This was no longer just Burkina Faso's wound. This was Africa's wound. On the great screen, Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared. His voice was measured, but the iron beneath it was unmistakable. "If the sovereignty of one African nation can be violated without consequence," he said, "then none of us are safe. Burkina Faso will not stand alone. And I believe neither will you." From Mali came swift agreement. From Niger, a voice of defiance. From Guinea, a declaration of solidarity. Even in Nigeria, the continent's giant, voices rose demanding stronger resistance to Western intrusion. Senegal and Ghana, more cautious and long-aligned with Washington, urged explanations from the United States, but they too spoke the word sovereignty, and once spoken, it could not be taken back. Meanwhile, in the streets of Africa, a different kind of diplomacy unfolded. In Bamako, Mali, 50,000 demonstrators filled Independence Avenue, waving the flag of Burkina Faso alongside their own. In Conakry, Guinea, candles flickered in vigil for the 3 lives lost in Yatna. Even in Nairobi, where ties with America run deep, small but fierce protests rang out, their chants echoing across the avenues, "Africa is not your playground." Radio call-in shows from Dakar to Lagos filled with passionate voices. Mothers, veterans, students, all demanding that their governments stand firm. One elderly caller in Accra summed it up: "If they can strike Ouagadougou today, they can strike Accra tomorrow." Unity is not a dream. It is survival. The conversation grew larger still, connecting to the harsh reality of the Sahel. In recent years, jihadist groups like JNIM, Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, have swelled to more than 6,000 fighters, spreading terror from Burkina Faso to Mali. Towns have fallen, villages forced under strict rule, families torn apart. And yet, when America claimed this strike was about anti-terror, no evidence was shown. No names, no photographs, no details, only silence. It was here that many Africans saw the pattern clearly. The fight against terrorism was being used as a cover for the old arrogance, external powers imposing their will upon African soil. What was framed as protection smelled instead of domination. By the close of that second day, the sense of awakening was undeniable. In Ouagadougou, the crowd still sang. In Addis Ababa, ministers still debated. In Bamako, the people still marched. And across the continent, a chorus was forming, a chorus that no longer asked permission, but demanded recognition. What began as a single strike in the dark of dawn had now become a Pan-African rallying cry. This was no longer about Burkina Faso alone. It was about the future of a continent that had too long borne the weight of foreign boots. Beyond Africa's borders, the storm raged louder still. In Washington, the Pentagon called a press briefing within 24 hours of the strike. A suited spokesperson stepped to the podium, calm on the surface, but straining beneath the weight of the world's questions. He declared the operation a targeted anti-terrorist action, insisting that intelligence had revealed an imminent threat to American assets in the Sahel. But when the journalists pressed him, who were these militants? Where was the proof? What names? What faces? What dates? None were offered. Only vague phrases, recycled from a familiar script. And in Africa, that absence of evidence spoke louder than all their words. At the United Nations in New York, Burkina Faso's ambassador demanded an emergency session of the Security Council. For 3 heated hours, the chamber reverberated with competing voices. Russia and China were unequivocal. This strike was a violation of sovereignty, plain and simple. France, still nursing its own setbacks in the Sahel, hedged its words, calling for restraint on all sides. Britain and Germany expressed concern, but sought to avoid breaking openly with Washington. And in Africa, people listened closely, taking note of who stood where. Meanwhile, in the streets of the diaspora, a new wave rose. In Paris, in London, in New York City, Burkina communities and Pan-African activists filled squares and avenues. They carried placards not just of Burkina Faso, but of Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah. Their speeches thundered against modern colonialism, draped in military uniforms. The echoes of the drums and slogans traveled across oceans, binding Africa and its children abroad in shared defiance. The media fractured along predictable lines. In America, CNN and Fox News amplified the terrorist threat narrative, while NPR and The Intercept questioned legality and strategic wisdom. In Europe, The Guardian and Le Monde asked whether this would accelerate Africa's pivot away from old alliances. On African networks, however, the story was sharper, truer. It was about sovereignty. Clips of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's speech replayed every hour. Interviews with villagers from Yatena spoke of grief, but also of resolve. And as coverage spread, comparisons emerged. Commentators in Bamako and Ouagadougou invoked Thomas Sankara, the slain revolutionary who once declared that Africa must dare to invent its own future. They said the young Traoré in his camouflage was carrying Sankara's torch into a new century. In the military skies of the Sahel, another truth revealed itself. Burkina Faso had already begun to equip itself with Turkish Bayraktar drones and Russian aircraft. The United States strike was not happening in a vacuum. It came amidst a shifting battlefield where African states, desperate for control, were turning to new partners. To many Africans, this was the evidence of a world no longer unipolar. Choices existed. Alternatives were possible. By the end of that first week, the intended intimidation of the strike had faltered. What Washington sought as a warning had instead become a rallying point. Across Africa, the sentiment was clear. The days of unilateral intervention, cloaked in the language of counterterrorism, could no longer go unchallenged. And around the world, observers began to whisper the same question: had America miscalculated? From the ashes of outrage, strategy began to take form. In Bamako, under the watch of desert skies, three nations gathered: Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Together, they signed a pact that would soon be called the Sahel Shield Alliance. It was more than paper. It was a declaration. An injury to one would be an injury to all. A strike on Ouagadougou would summon Bamako and Niamey. For the first time in the decades, Sahelian states dared to imagine defense not borrowed from abroad but forged in African hands. Across the continent, the ripple deepened. In Algiers, diplomats met behind closed doors with representatives from Chad and Guinea. Proposals flowed, shared intelligence platforms, pooled funding for African-made weapons, reduced reliance on imported arms from Paris or Washington. The words were cautious, but the intent was clear. A movement was underway to reclaim the continent's security. Back in Burkina Faso, the momentum was both political and popular. Polling from Ouagadougou's own Institute of Public Opinion recorded something extraordinary. Captain Traoré's approval rating, once 62%, soared to 78%, then 82%. In coffee stalls and village markets, people said it plainly. He had stood when others bowed. But alongside pride came pressure. The Ministry of Trade announced emergency measures to stabilize the economy. Yet within a week, diesel prices climbed 12%. Grain and millet in the northern provinces rose by nearly 10%. Families already burdened by jihadist violence now faced the sting of inflation. Markets whispered of panic. In Ouagadougou, near the strike zone, schools closed for 2 days as parents kept children home. Radio hosts took call after call. If another strike comes, where is our shield? The government responded swiftly. Ministers toured the provinces, holding town halls, explaining both the military readiness and the diplomatic moves underway. State television aired nightly bulletins on defense preparations and food security. The goal was simple: to project control, to calm the shaken, to keep the flame from turning to fear. Civil society, however, was not silent. Lawyers and activists began to press harder. Yes, sovereignty was sacred. Yes, defiance was necessary. But where was the evidence of the terrorist threat America claimed? One lawyer in Ouagadougou said it with sharp clarity: "We must defend our land with truth, not only with speeches." And yet, in the eyes of many, the bigger picture outshone these doubts. For decades, security had been outsourced, first to France, then to wider Western coalitions. Now, for the first time, Africans were speaking of defense as their own responsibility. Unity is no longer a dream, one Nigerian analyst declared on international radio. It is survival. In Washington, diplomats watched with unease. Influence built over 2 decades of counter-terror cooperation was eroding before their eyes. Where once America had been the indispensable partner, now leaders were looking elsewhere. To Moscow, to Ankara, to Beijing, to each other. What was meant as a warning had become a turning point. In the weeks that followed, the face of Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared everywhere. On billboards in Ouagadougou, on news broadcasts in Bamako, on hand-painted murals in Conakry. Not as just a president, but as a symbol. The youngest head of state on the continent, yet carrying the weight of generations. At the African Union's extraordinary summit in Addis Ababa, cameras captured a telling image. Traoré walked among leaders twice his age, yet the spotlight clung to him. Dressed in his camouflage fatigues, he declared before the assembly, "Sovereignty is not a gift. It is a responsibility." and it belongs to those who will defend it. The words landed heavy, replayed on African screens, repeated in African tongues. Across social media, comments compared him to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary whose life was cut short, but whose dream of Pan-African independence had never died. To many, Traoré was not repeating Sankara's slogans. He was reviving his spirit in the flesh. But the measure of a leader is not rhetoric alone. In Ouagadougou, his government began reviewing mining contracts for gold and manganese. New clauses favored national ownership over foreign corporations. By cutting into the veins where colonial leverage had long flowed, the extraction of resources, Traoré struck at the heart of dependency. When Western aid threatened suspension, his administration did not fold. Instead, Burkina Faso pivoted towards African partners, towards Asia, grain shipments rerouted, investments sought from non-Western allies. In doing so, the crisis that critics predicted never materialized. Instead, it proved a point: dependence was not destiny. Then came the echo. 2 months after the Athena strike, another incident erupted in Niger. An unauthorized drone attack claimed 4 civilian lives. The outrage was immediate. The parallels to Burkina Faso undeniable. Within 24 hours, Niger's interim leadership reached out to Traoré, and together they appeared side by side in Niamey, flanked by defense ministers. Their joint statement was short but historic. The era of unilateral foreign strikes in Africa is over. The word spread like wildfire. Mali endorsed. Guinea applauded. Chad echoed. In East Africa, Tanzania and Uganda lent support. Even in parliaments, usually aligned with the West, debates erupted. Why should foreign militaries strike at will upon African soil? From the Mossi of Burkina Faso to the Tuareg of Mali, from the Hausa of Niger to the Swahili of the East, a shared conviction grew that Africa's dignity was indivisible, its sovereignty non-negotiable. To see Traoré standing shoulder to shoulder with Niger's leaders was more than politics. It was a vision made visible. For decades, Africans had spoken of unity, but now before their eyes, leaders dared to embody it. And in that image, many saw more than 2 men. They saw a continent, scarred by history, but unbent by fear, stepping into a new posture. The missile strike that was meant to humble had instead lifted heads. The drone that was meant to silence had instead ignited voices. From Ouagadougou to Niamey, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, a single message took root. Africa would not ask permission to be free. And in Captain Ibrahim Traoré, many believed they saw the torchbearer of that awakening. From a single strike at dawn, a continent awoke. What was meant to be a warning became a spark. What was meant to instill fear became a fire of defiance. In Ouagadougou, 3 lives were lost. But across Africa, millions found their voice. They marched, they sang, they raised flags, not only of Burkina Faso, but of Africa itself. From Bamako to Nairobi, from Conakry to Johannesburg, the chant echoed, "Our land, our right, our future." And in that echo, one figure stood tall. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, once a young officer thrust into power, now a continental symbol. He did not flinch when foreign power struck his soil. He did not bow when sanctions were threatened. He spoke, and his words carried the weight of a generation that had waited too long for his dignity to be recognized. Captain Ibrahim's latest news, as it flashed across African screens, was no longer the story of a nation under siege. It was the story of a continent reclaiming its sovereignty. Even in the halls of Washington, they admitted privately the strike had backfired. Influence built over 20 years was slipping away. Yes, the challenges remain. Terrorist groups still roam the Sahel. Economies strain under pressure. Foreign powers will not retreat willingly. But the line has been drawn. And across Africa, the people know it. So we must ask ourselves, will this flame endure? Can this awakening become a movement that cannot be silenced? If you believe the answer is yes, write Africa Rise in the comments below. And hear this call. If this story moves something in your chest, like,